Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 3 for PC, Mac, and Linux. This is a real-time strategy game and the sequel to Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 2. It was developed by Relic Entertainment and published by Sega in April of last year, and it ended up getting a pretty mixed reception depending on who you asked. If you asked one of the mainstream publications, generally they saw it as a rather solid game, whereas a good amount of the fanbase has been overwhelmingly negative toward the game and has pretty much abandoned it at this point. In fact, it got so bad that Relic ended up actually abandoning development of the game, and any expansion packs or DLCs that they were working on basically just got scrapped. So the real question here becomes, why did the fanbase get so vitriolic towards it and abandon it so quickly when it didn't even really have a chance to get off the ground? Well, let's go ahead and delve into it and find out what exactly we're dealing with here. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's a bit of a mix between the styles of Dawn of War 1 and 2, but also with its own bits of style thrown in as well. So you have kind of a mix of the scale of Dawn of War 1, but with the more detailed units of Dawn of War 2, but with improvements made to general visual quality with some better texture work, the environments being a bit more detailed, the particle effects being considerably better, and also a fair bit more color in this one. There's a lot more brighter, more cartoony elements thrown into this than what you saw in the previous games of the series, but it doesn't really go so far that you lose the Warhammer 40,000 look and feel. Now that said, they did remove the finisher animations that you saw in Dawn of War 1 and 2, which does mean it loses some of that Dawn of War look and feel, but it still definitely looks and feels Warhammer 40k at least. Now that said, the interface is a bit messy. I mean, you have your unit selection being at the very bottom of the screen, except for elite units, which are on a column on the left side of the screen, so that's a bit of an odd use of space, and it does take some getting used to. So overall, the visuals are pretty solid, but then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit messier. On the one hand, you have voice acting, which is generally quite good. The characters are voiced rather well, and it's what we've pretty much come to expect from the Dawn of War series at this point. Most of it is pretty over the top and very fitting for a Warhammer 40,000 game, so that ends up working out quite well. And you do have some pretty solid sound effects for the most part. I mean, this is a real-time strategy game. We don't really expect a lot of very hard-hitting sound effects, but Relic definitely understands the value of some good sound effects, so they've done a pretty good job with what they've got here. But then there's the soundtrack. Now, Dawn of War 1 and 2 both had a pretty recognizable style of these kind of sweeping, epic orchestral tracks with a lot of choral arrangements as well. And you don't really get that with Dawn of War 3. Instead, they've gone with something that's a lot more dark and ominous, and at the same time, it also ends up being a lot more monotonous. A lot of the tracks sound nearly the same to one another, and while it's certainly perfect for the grimdark future of the 41st millennium, it doesn't really fit in all that well with the Dawn of War series. So it's both a negative and positive element at the same time, and it just ends up being a bit confusing. So overall, they've done a good job with the sound design, it's just that the soundtrack is going to be pretty hit or miss depending on what you really expect out of the Dawn of War games. But while the presentation is certainly important for a Dawn of War game, what really matter are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as 3 different factions throughout the course of the campaign. Those are, of course, the Imperium, represented by the Space Marines, in this particular case the Blood Ravens, as well as the Orcs under War Boss Gore, and the Eldar under Farseer Maka. The campaign begins on the planet of Cyprus Ultima, a world controlled by the Imperial Knight House Varlock, which is currently under siege from an Orc horde. And you start things off playing as the Space Marines, and specifically the Blood Ravens chapter, headed by Gabriel Angelos, who defies orders from an Inquisitor who's set up his forces in orbit and is refusing to land on the planet to give the Imperial Knights any aid, and you end up going in there and basically breaking the siege. From there, the perspective switches over to the Orcs, and you lead War Boss Gore on his quest to become the main War Boss of the Orc invasion, and you get out from under the thumb of the apparently moron War Boss Gitstompa, and in so doing creating a really big and really ridiculous cannon. It's in this particular mission that the Eldar show up, under the leadership of Farseer Maka, who is actually under orders from Autarch Kyre, and the battle ultimately continues over control of Cyprus Ultima for a while until the actual main story is revealed regarding the lost planet of Acheron, which has been bouncing around the warp and is now about to emerge, and an Eldar artifact hidden somewhere on the planet known as the Spear of Cain, a weapon of immense power that all of the factions ultimately end up fighting over. Now, of course, the plot is a bit more complicated than simply all three of the factions are fighting over a really pointy stick, but even when more is revealed about the plot, it never really becomes all that interesting, and the various subplots that they try to shoehorn into the campaign don't really help things out either. So it really does fall to gameplay to bring things up, and as far as the campaign is concerned, it doesn't really do anything that any other real-time strategy game hasn't already done and really done better. And to make matters worse, if you think you might be able to go through the campaign in order to get the sort of tutorial experience to teach you how to play each of the factions, it doesn't really work out that way because every single one of the missions, your faction changes. And because you're constantly switching back and forth between all of the factions, you never really get comfortable with one particular faction at any given point. So if you really want to learn the faction in its entirety, you really do need to just do a trial by fire and basically go into the skirmish mode and just play it over and over again until you get comfortable with it. A better way to handle the campaign would have been to do one of two things. Either make 3 separate campaigns, one for each faction, or have it split into different sections, where maybe the first section you're playing as the Space Marines, the second one you're playing as the Orcs, and the third one you're playing as the Eldar, or some combination thereof, to get you used to how each of the factions plays individually, and give you more time to get all of your fundamentals down before progressing to the next faction, which might be a radically different playstyle, or might just be more difficult to play in general. This ultimately leads me into the discussion of the actual mechanics of Dawn of War 3, and most importantly how it compares to the previous 2 games in the series. Because the first thing you have to understand is that there's actually no unified theory of Dawn of War 2. Dawn of War 1 and 2 play very differently from one another. The first Dawn of War and its expansions generally play like pretty traditional real-time strategy games where you have a lot of base building, you have a pretty large-scale battle with a lot of units on screen at once, and while they did introduce a few different mechanics like the resource point control as well as the cover mechanics, it generally played like a pretty traditional real-time strategy game. Dawn of War 2, on the other hand, was much more of a real-time tactics game than a real-time strategy game, where you focused on small units that had special abilities, and you worked on getting them into flanking maneuvers, getting them into cover, getting your angles down, that sort of thing. And while it certainly did have a few elements returning from Dawn of War 1, it mostly played a lot more like Company of Heroes, but on a smaller scale. Of course, Retribution broadened the scale a bit, but generally speaking, when you're talking Dawn of War 1, you're talking a pretty traditional real-time strategy game with a lot of stuff on screen at once, and Dawn of War 2, you're talking small unit tactics with a lot more special abilities than anything else. Then you get to Dawn of War 3, and it tries to unify both of those playstyles. And the way they decided to do that was to bring back the base building element from Dawn of War 1, although it's definitely simplified compared to that game, and the actual scale of the battles is definitely much more reminiscent of the original Dawn of War. At the same time, they brought back a lot of the unit ability stuff from Dawn of War 2, particularly with regards to hero units, which in this particular game are called elites. So as you play through the campaign, and of course play through the skirmish and multiplayer modes, your elite units will actually gradually level up and gain access to new abilities, new skins, that sort of thing, which is basically how the original Dawn of War 2 and Dawn of War 2 Chaos Rising campaigns went, where your units would gradually get more powerful and get new gear over time. Although in this particular case, it's more geared towards the skirmish mode than anything else, and you don't get war gear over time, you only get new special abilities and you get the skins. Now it should be noted that most of these special abilities are just passive bonuses that either happen when that particular elite unit is called in, or they happen in an aura around that elite unit or that sort of thing. But some of them do apply to your entire army, and usually those have the option of becoming doctrines later on in the progression. The doctrine mechanic is actually brought in from Company of Heroes 2. The idea is that you have a certain number of slots, in this particular case you have 3 slots, that you can fit various passive bonuses or particular special abilities into. So for example, one might give shielding to a unit that doesn't normally have it, or another might change the special abilities to do more damage in specific circumstances, or something might give a unit an entirely new special ability like being able to shoot in a line or something like that. The idea there being that they're fairly small but noticeable changes to your playstyle that you can really tailor to whatever you particularly like using when you are using that particular army. And while some of those doctrines are unlocked by leveling up the various elite units, a lot of them are simply available from the start, and you can basically slot in what you want at any given point before you go into the battle anyway. You also have 3 slots for elite units where you can swap out different units for whatever playstyle you're going for. So if you're going for kind of a rush-heavy playstyle, you can slot in a lot of low elite point units that will allow you to summon them pretty early on in the fight and get a pretty big advantage early on, but in that instance you might be sacrificing some late game potential, or you can make something that's more late game heavy or more mid game heavy, or just a combination thereof. And it really does give you a lot of freedom to mix and match and find the playstyle that's best suited to you. Now I mentioned elite points just a moment ago. These are points that gradually build up as you're playing a match. They're only available in the multiplayer and skirmish modes. And in those modes, it functions as your third resource. You have 2 main resources, Requisition and Power, which are used to build all of the units and buildings in the game, and you have the elite points, which are only used to summon your elite units. And once an elite unit is summoned, if it's ever reduced down to 0 hit points, it basically just retreats from the battlefield, and you eventually get the ability to summon it again after a lengthy cooldown. And once you've spent the elite units to summon the unit for the first time, you no longer need to spend any further elite points to summon it again. So if it's ever taken out, it's just that cooldown, and then you can just deploy it onto the field immediately. But as for the actual role of the elite units, I want to hold off on that for just a bit while I explain a few more of the general mechanics and the general way that the factions play. So in terms of the more general mechanics, some of the ideas from previous Dawn of War games do return in Dawn of War 3. For example, the resource point system is more or less the same as it's been in the previous 2 games, but with the change of the different resource points having different capacities for what type of resource they can generate. Some of them are going to be more requisition heavy, whereas others are more suited to generating power. This is actually closer to the way that Company of Heroes handled its resource point system, where you would have different points scattered around the map that you had to capture and build upon in order to gain resources of that specific type. So you would have fuel dumps, you would have requisition points, that sort of thing. In this particular case, both of them are part of the same generalized resource point, so instead of being like in previous Dawn of War games, where you would generally go and capture requisition points and then build generators in order to get more power at your main base, both are now handled by the actual resource points themselves, which means that the main gameplay is going to be spent fighting over these resource points way more so than previous Dawn of War games. They've also pretty dramatically changed the way that cover and concealment works. So, in previous Dawn of War games, you would have certain units that were capable of stealth. This is still the case with Dawn of War 3 as well, but you also have points scattered around the map where you can send your units into that location, and they'll actually be considered in stealth so the enemy can't see them until either that unit opens fire or if it moves out of that particular spot. The idea there is that you're supposed to be able to set up ambushes in those spots, but it actually makes the ambushes a lot more predictable than if the units were just capable of stealth on their own. Similarly, they've changed the way cover works to where in the previous Dawn of War games, you would have different locations that would be considered light, medium, or heavy cover, and you would send your units to those particular locations, they would spread out in that spot, and they would be given either one of those 3 cover types. In Dawn of War 3, on the other hand, cover is limited to very specific points on the map, where if you go and you capture those points, then they generate a shield that will deflect incoming fire. So if you want to actually damage a unit that is currently in that cover spot, then you can do one of 2 things. Either you can just keep shelling that particular cover spot until eventually the shield breaks down, or you can send melee units in because they can still do damage even while the cover is active. It's a mechanic where I'm not entirely sure what they were actually going for with it, because the way the cover system worked in previous Dawn of War games was more related to what scenery was around a given point, and what objects you could basically put between your units and whatever enemy units were coming after them. In other words, it worked as an actual cover system as opposed to just capture a point for a bonus shield. So frankly, it's a pretty messy way of handling that. But once you get past those changes made to the main mechanics, then you get to what is ultimately a pretty traditional real-time strategy game for the most part. You churn out your units, you send them to attack the enemy. Most of the time you're fighting over resource points, but ultimately you are working towards taking out the enemy base, and how you do that is going to depend on the game mode you're playing. So, more recently they introduced the Annihilation game mode, which is a straightforward real-time strategy skirmish mode, where your only objective is to just wipe the enemy out. The other mode, which was in there since launch, is a more objective-focused mode, where you're still ultimately trying to defeat the enemy by destroying their base, but you're only working towards destroying specific base structures. Specifically, you're working towards destroying power nodes and turrets, which allow you to get to the main power core, and once you've destroyed that, then you've beaten the enemy. A lot of you will probably recognize this as basically being a mode where you're playing a MOBA, but in more regular real-time strategy game form. And like a lot of MOBAs, it ultimately becomes a battle of attrition. You gradually wear down the enemy structures until eventually you manage to break through the defenses, get to the power core, and destroy it. And that can become very, very tedious. And to make matters worse, even though that is actually the main mode of the multiplayer, it didn't really put a lot of effort into making it feel like a Warhammer 40,000 version of the mode, because the various structures that you're defending and attacking in that particular mode look nothing like anything in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. And that all just goes a long way to making the mode feel like it was done purely because MOBAs are popular and not because it was actually a good fit for Dawn of War. And that actually presents a pretty nasty problem because that's one of the only two modes in the game other than the campaign. So that means that there's not really a whole lot of variety in the actual multiplayer and the skirmish modes, and you're going to be playing the same mode over and over and over again, and it's probably going to be Annihilation. It is, after all, a pretty traditional real-time strategy mode, and it's been in the previous Dawn of War games as well, so you'll probably feel the most comfortable going into that if you're already a fan of the series, and it's definitely less tedious than the other mode. But even once you get past that, you find that the core gameplay doesn't really feel like the previous Dawn of War games as much as it just feels like StarCraft. Obviously, there are differences between the way the factions play in this and StarCraft, but you have to admit there is a pretty uncanny similarity, where the Eldar are basically the Protoss, the Orcs are basically the Zerg, and the Space Marines are basically the Terrans. The main differences there are that the Space Marines have the drop pod mechanic where they can spawn units in drop pods and tactically insert them into various spots on the map, and the Orcs have the WOG mechanic, which gives them pretty nasty power-ups. The Eldar, on the other hand, play pretty much exactly like the Protoss do, down to the shields, the warping mechanics, the psyker powers. It all feels very familiar if you've played Protoss in StarCraft. But here's the thing, even though the factions in their basic forms are pretty similar to what you would see in StarCraft, it's the particulars that set Dawn of War 3 apart. Obviously, it immediately has a very different feel from the way StarCraft plays, just by nature of the way the resources are gathered, the way the cover system works, all that sort of thing. But there's also the extremely micromanagement heavy combat. This is where the elites come into play in particular, because even though your various squads of units generally have special abilities of their own, like flinging grenades at things and that sort of thing, the elite units are the most micro heavy out of all of them, because when they show up on the field, they are absolutely devastating. These are units that in a lot of cases can wipe out entire armies all by themselves, and a lot of that is because of the various special abilities they have. So for example, Farseer Maka has an ability where she can throw her spear, and that will land at a certain point, and then she can actually call down a psychic storm to blast the area around her, only if the spear has been thrown, then it will actually blast whatever that area around the spear is. And each of the elite units has different special abilities like that, so you're going to find that you're going to be constantly using those special abilities, waiting for the cooldowns, moving them around an awful lot, and also moving around and using the special abilities of your various basic units as well, meaning a lot of your time and focus is going to be spent on the battles themselves as opposed to building up your forces and building up your economy. And you can tell that's intentional both from the way the game mechanics actually work, and the addition of the battle phase escalations, where as you continue playing, your battle phase will continue escalating, and it will gradually give you resource bonuses to the point where you eventually don't even really have to worry about your resource gathering rate if you make it far into the game enough. This has multiple effects. On the one hand, it makes the end game pretty fast-paced and kind of chaotic in a lot of ways, but on the other, it means that starting out, things feel really slow, and you find that all the really fun stuff is more towards the mid to late game, because that's when your resource gather rate picks up from the battle phase escalations, and things get a lot more interesting. Now, of course, you could say the same thing about just about any real-time strategy game, but in this particular case, it really does make the early game feel like it drags on, and once you get towards the mid parts of the game and the late parts of the game, it really does pick up a lot more, and you feel like you're playing almost a completely different game. Of course, that's a double-edged sword as well, because by the time you hit the late game, you've probably got a lot of elite units on the field, and you've probably got a lot of general units on the field as well, and actually micromanaging all of that becomes a lot more difficult, and a lot more tedious. And even worse than simply becoming a lot more difficult and tedious is that it means you're really going down to more reflexes than actual strategy at that point, and it ultimately becomes a matter of just overwhelming the enemy with a massive amount of firepower, both from the amount of units you've got, and much more importantly, what elite units you have. It really becomes obvious when you're playing those late matches that the elite units are the real star of the show here. They dictate whether or not you are going to win. And once you understand that, unfortunately the entire game unravels, because it just becomes a matter of attrition, building up your forces until eventually you can summon your elite units and just completely demolish the enemy with them. And depending on how you're playing, that means that the game can either be just this continuous slog back and forth, where elite units are battling other elite units on top of the armies battling the other armies, and nobody's able to really gain ground, or it will be a matter of one side just completely demolishing the other before that side has any time to react. And that can become incredibly irritating to deal with. So what you find is that once you discover the core loop of the gameplay, it very quickly loses its luster, and all of the interesting moments where you call in your elite units only to smash the enemy quickly become pretty trivial. And the ultimate result of all of this is it just makes the game extremely boring. And that's ultimately the biggest sin the game could have possibly committed. If the game were good but had a few missteps, then that'd be one thing. If the game were outright bad, then I could still work with that, because at least bad games can often be so bad they're funny, or they're irritating enough to be able to work with that. But once a game is boring, there's just no saving it. And no amount of Warhammer 40,000 styling could have possibly fixed that. Much like I don't really think it's possible to create a sort of unified theory of Dawn of War. Dawn of War 1 and 2 play very differently from one another, and as you see with Dawn of War 3, when they tried to combine the playstyles to effectively force a unified theory of Dawn of War, it just failed miserably. You end up with a mess of a real-time strategy game that doesn't seem to know what it really wants to be, and it just ends up being extremely boring as a result, satisfying neither the fans of Dawn of War 1 nor the fans of Dawn of War 2. They just went back to whichever game they preferred and left Dawn of War 3 in the dust. And with the way the story plays it fairly fast and loose with the 40k lore, they couldn't even really satisfy Warhammer 40,000 fans with it. And with the extremely limited amount of content in the game, where you do certainly have a sizable campaign, but there's no co-op mode, there's no last stand mode like there was in Dawn of War 2, the maps in the multiplayer are pretty limited, and you only have 2 modes for the multiplayer and skirmish anyway, and of course there's only 3 factions, with an additional one that was teased at the very end of the game. If you stay after the credits, they tease the Necrons, which haven't been in the series since Dark Crusade, which of course we're no longer getting because they decided to completely stop all development on Dawn of War 3 and wipe their hands of the project. Well, there's not really a whole lot going on here. It ultimately means that Dawn of War 3 is just a completely forgettable letdown for everyone involved, whether you're a fan of Dawn of War 1, Dawn of War 2, both, or simply a fan of Warhammer 40,000 or real-time strategy games. And while it's certainly playable, there's not really much reason to play it, which ultimately means I give it a 2 out of 5. I simply can't really recommend it to anybody, but it's still not an outright bad game. It's, again, playable, most of the mechanics at least work somewhat, it's just they don't work particularly well, and there's nothing really all that interesting about it. so you can just pretty safely avoid it. Thanks for watching.